Thomas Alive to Die presents
Eastern Airlines. Eastern Airlines was a composite of assorted air travel corporations, including Florida Airways and Pitcairn Aviation. In the late 1920s, Pitcairn Aviation won a contract to fly mail between New York City and Atlanta, Georgia on mail-wing single-engine aircraft. In 1929, Clement Keyes, the owner of North American Aviation, purchased Pitcairn. In 1930, Keyes changed the company's name to Eastern Air Transport. After being purchased by General Motors and experiencing a change in leadership after the Airmail Act of 1934, the airline became known as Eastern Airlines. December 19, 1936, a Douglas DC-2-112 struck trees and crashed near Milford, Connecticut due to pilot error and radio problems. All 11 on board survived. The aircraft was leased from North American Aviation. By 1937, Eastern's route system stretched from New York to Washington, Atlanta, and New Orleans, and from Chicago to Miami. In the same year, it operated 20 daily flights and returns, every hour on the hour, between New York and Washington. The flight time was 1 hour, 20 minutes, one way. August 10, 1937, Trip 7, a Douglas DC-2, crashed on takeoff at Daytona Beach Municipal Airport after it struck a utility pylon during a nighttime takeoff, killing 4 of 9 on board. In 1938, World War I flying ace Eddie Rickenbacker bought Eastern from General Motors. The complex deal was concluded when Rickenbacker together with Sidney Shannon presented Alfred P. Sloan with a certified check for $3,500,000 equivalent to $75,760,000 in 2023. October 18, 1938, a Douglas DC-2-112 had engine failure while taking off from Montgomery, Alabama. The engine caught fire and fell from the plane. The plane struck a tree upon landing in a field just a few miles from the airport. All 13 on board, including the crew of 3, survived with only the captain, John David Hissong, sustaining minor burns. February 26, 1941, Flight 21, a Douglas DST, crashed near Atlanta in fog due to a misread altimeter, almost killing Eddie Rickenbacker, who was traveling on airline business. His recovery in the hospital received broad press coverage. During his initial recovery, several incorrect news reports claimed that he had died. Of 16 on board, 8 died, including Congressman William D. Byron. Clara Savage Littledale, editor of Parents magazine, survived. Littledale recounted her experience of the crash for Parents. Her husband, Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist Harold A. Littledale, was paralyzed as a result of the crash. April 3, 1941, a Douglas DC-3201B crashed into water off Vero Beach, Florida during a storm. Although all 16 on board were injured, none were killed. The aircraft was written off. November 19, 1943, Trip 12, a Douglas DC-3201E, made an emergency landing at New Orleans en route from Houston after the pilot allowed the aircraft to descend too low during the second attempt to land. The number 1 propeller hit the water, causing portions of the engine and cowling to break off. All 15 on board survived. The aircraft was repaired and returned to service. July 12, 1945, Flight 45, a Douglas DC-3201C flying from Washington, D.C. to Columbia, South Carolina, collided in midair with a SOF A-26C Invader near Florence, South Carolina. The A-26 lost control and crashed. 2 crew parachuted but only 1 survived. The DC-3 executed a forced landing in a cornfield, killing 1 passenger, a 2-year-old boy. September 7, 1945, Flight 42, a Douglas DC-3201G, crashed near Florence, South Carolina following an unexplained fire in the rear of the aircraft. Control was lost after the right elevator also caught fire and the aircraft crashed in a swampy, wooded area, killing all 22 on board. December 30, 1945, Flight 14, a Douglas DC-3-201, overran the runway while landing at LaGuardia Airport after approaching too high and too fast, killing 1 of 14 aboard. January 18, 1946, Flight 105, a Douglas DC-3201E, crashed at Cheshire, Connecticut after a loss of control caused by wing separation, killing all 17 on board. A fire, caused by a fuel leak, started in the left engine and spread to the wing, causing it to collapse and fail. October 11, 1946, Flight 546, a Douglas C-54B, struck a ridge near Alexandria, Virginia while on approach to Washington National Airport. All 26 on board survived. During the approach, the aircraft had descended too low. December 19, 1946, Flight 605, a Douglas C-54B collided in midair with Universal Airlines Flight 7, a Douglas C-47, near Aberdeen, Maryland. The C-47 departed Newark for Raleigh, while the C-54 departed Newark 15 minutes later for a non-stop flight to Miami. Near Aberdeen, the C-54 flew past the C-47. The C-54 co-pilot saw the lights of an aircraft close in to the left of the C-54, which turned out to be the C-47. The C-54 pilot rolled into a right bank and forcefully pulled up the nose, causing the rear of the C-54 to strike the forward top portion of the C-47. The C-47 landed safely at Phillips Army Airfield while the C-54 diverted to Washington. There were no casualties on either aircraft and both aircraft were repaired and returned to service. January 12, 1947, Flight 665, a Douglas C-49, crashed at Galax, Virginia after the pilot deviated from the flight route, killing 18 of 19 on board. May 30, 1947, Flight 605, a Douglas DC-4 en route from Newark to Miami, crashed near Bainbridge, Maryland, killing all 53 aboard. At the time, Flight 605 was the deadliest crash in United States aviation history. Loss of control was cited as the reason for the crash. January 13, 1948, Flight 572, a Douglas DC-3201F, crashed at Oxon Hill, Maryland after striking trees while on approach to Washington National Airport, killing 5 of 9 on board. The aircraft was flying too low. January 21, 1948, Flight 604, a Lockheed L-649 Constellation, crashed into a snow bank while landing at Logan International Airport following a loss of control due to a snow-covered runway. All 25 on board survived. February 7, 1948, Flight 611, a Lockheed L-649 Constellation, suffered a propeller blade separation over the Atlantic Ocean 156 miles off Brunswick, Georgia. 3 hours after takeoff, the number 3 propeller failed and a portion of a blade penetrated the fuselage, cutting control cables, electrical wires and engine controls and killing a crew member before exiting the fuselage on the opposite side. After this, the front portion of the number 3 engine broke free and fell off. A rapid descent was initiated. At 12,000 feet the descent was stopped. Due to instrument failure, the aircraft descended visually to 1,000 feet. On landing, the number 4 engine was shut down and the brakes applied hard, which blew out a tire. Fire started in the landing gear and number 4 engine but were quickly extinguished. Despite the damage, the aircraft was repaired and returned to service. November 1, 1949, Flight 537, a Douglas DC-4 on approach to Washington National Airport, collided in midair with a Lockheed P-38 Lightning being test flown for acceptance by the government of Bolivia, killing all 55 aboard the DC-4 and seriously injuring the pilot of the P-38. At the time, it was the deadliest airliner crash in United States history. July 19, 1951, Flight 601, a Lockheed L-749A Constellation, suffered severe buffeting after an access door opened in flight. A flapless wheels-up landing was made at Curls Neck Farm, Virginia. The aircraft was later repaired and returned to service. November 27, 1951, Flight 167, a Douglas DC-3201C collided in midair with Civil Air Patrol Piper L-4J near Ocala, Florida. The Piper was climbing after a left turn when it struck the DC-3. The DC-3's number 1 propeller made several cuts in the Piper's left wing, causing a loss of control and the Piper crashed, killing the pilot. The DC-3 circled the airport for a few minutes before landing safely with no casualties. September 6, 1953, an L-1049 Super Constellation crashed on landing at McChord Air Force Base due to a hydraulic failure caused by engine problems. All 32 on board survived. October 19, 1953, a Lockheed L-749A Constellation from Idlewild International Airport to San Juan, Puerto Rico, crashed shortly after takeoff, killing 2 of 27 on board. May 8, 1954, Eastern Airlines Flight 2634 Watts made an emergency landing at Naval Auxiliary Air Station Edenton, now Northeastern Regional Airport in Edenton, North Carolina. All crew and passengers survived. This is according to a letter written by Chairman of the Board, Eddie Rickenbacker, to Marine Air Base Squadron 14. December 21, 1955, a Lockheed L-749A Constellation crashed on approach to Jacksonville's Ameson Airport, arriving from Miami, with further scheduled stops at Washington, D.C., New York and Boston. 12 passengers and a crew of 5 were killed. In 1956, Eastern bought Colonial Airlines, giving the airline its first routes to Canada. February 17, 1956, a Martin 404 crashed near Owensboro, Kentucky. Due to pilot error, all 23 on board survived. The aircraft stalled and crashed following an improperly executed final approach. March 10, 1957, a Martin 404 crashed on landing at Standiford Field due to pilot error. All 34 on board survived. A portion of the left wing separated inboard of the number 1 engine due to excessive sink rate caused by the pilot's landing approach technique. June 28, 1957, a Douglas DC-7B had just returned from a training flight and was taxiing to the maintenance hangar at Miami International Airport when it collided with a parked Eastern Airlines L-1049 Super Constellation near the hangar. Fuel leaked and both aircraft caught fire and burned out. March 17, 1958, a Martin 404 flight unknown on final approach to Melbourne Municipal Airport in Melbourne, Florida, struck an unmarked pile of gravel at the approach end of the runway. During the landing roll, the landing gear collapsed, and the aircraft caught fire and burned. All 10 occupants, 3 crew, 7 passengers evacuated safely. On October 1, 1959, Rickenbacker's position as CEO was taken over by Malcolm A. McIntyre, a brilliant lawyer but a man inexperienced in airline operations. Rickenbacker's ouster was largely due to his reluctance to acquire expensive jets, as he underestimated their appeal to the public. In November 1959, Eastern Airlines opened its Chester L. Churchill designed Terminal 1 at New York City's Idlewild International Airport, later renamed John F. Kennedy International Airport. In 1960, Eastern's first jets, Douglas DC-821s, started to take over the longer flights, like the nonstops from Chicago and New York City to Miami. October 4, 1960, Flight 375, a Lockheed L-188 Electra departing Boston's Logan International Airport for Philadelphia, crashed on takeoff after striking a flock of birds. 62 of the 72 passengers and crew were killed. The DC-8s were joined in 1962 by the Boeing 720 and in 1964 by the Boeing 727-100, which Eastern, along with American Airlines and United Airlines, had helped Boeing to develop. November 30, 1962, Flight 512, a Douglas DC-7 crashed during a go-around after failing to land due to fog at Idlewild Airport, now JFK, in New York City. Of the 51 passengers and crew on board, 25 were killed. On April 30, 1961, Eastern inaugurated Eastern Airlines Shuttle. Initially 95-seat Lockheed Constellation 1049s and 1049CS left New York LaGuardia every 2 hours, 8 a.m. to 10 p.m., to Washington National and to Boston. Flights soon became hourly, 7 a.m. to 10 p.m. out of each city. No reservations or tickets were required. Passengers could pay their fare in cash on board the flight. If a plane filled up at departure time, another plane was rolled out to carry any extra passengers. Internationalization began as Eastern opened routes to markets such as Santo Domingo and Nassau, Bahamas. Services from San Juan, Puerto Rico's Luis Muñoz Marine International Airport were expanded. July 24, 1961, Flight 202, a Lockheed L-188 Electra, was hijacked to Cuba. A fighter plane from Homestead AFB followed the airliner until it reached Cuban airspace. A new management team headed by Floyd D. Hall took over on December 16, 1963, and Rickenbacker left his position as director and chairman of the board on December 31, 1963, aged 73. On February 1, 1964, Eastern was the first airline to fly the 727. Shortly after that, Captain Eddie Rickenbacker retired and a new image was adopted, which included the now famous hockey stick design, officially Caribbean blue over ionosphere blue. Eastern was also the first U.S. carrier to fly the Airbus A300 and the launch customer for the Boeing 757. February 25, 1964, Flight 304, a Douglas DC-8 flying from New Orleans International Airport to Washington National Airport crashed into Lake Pontchartrain en route due to degradation of aircraft stability characteristics and turbulence, because of abnormal longitudinal trim component positions. All 51 passengers and 7 crew aboard were killed. February 8, 1965, Flight 663, a Douglas DC-7 departing from New York City to Richmond, Virginia, crashed at Jones Beach State Park after takeoff from JFK when it was forced to evade inbound Pan Am Flight 212. All 84 on board died. The evasive action was blamed for causing the plane to lose control. December 4, 1965, Flight 853, a Lockheed L-1049C Super Constellation, collided with TWA Flight 42, a Boeing 707, over Carmel, New York. The Constellation crashed on Hunt Mountain in North Salem, New York, killing 4 of 53 on board while the 707 landed safely with no casualties. October 18, 1966, a Lockheed L-1049C Super Constellation caught fire during refueling at Miami after a fuel line ruptured, causing substantial damage to the wing. The aircraft was written off and broken up in June 1967. In 1967, Eastern purchased Mackey Airlines, a small air carrier primarily operating in Florida and the Bahamas as part of this expansion. September 20, 1968, Flight 950, a Boeing 720, was hijacked to Cuba. February 3, 1969, Flight 7 was hijacked to Cuba. The presence of candid camera host Alan Funt on the flight led many of the passengers to conclude that the hijacking was actually a prank. Funt and others were later released after 11 hours of captivity. The famous Wings of Man campaign in the late 1960s was created by advertising agency Young & Rubicam, and restored Eastern's tarnished image until the late 1970s, when former astronaut Frank Borman became president and it was replaced by a new campaign, We Have to Earn Our Wings Every Day. The new campaign, which featured Borman as a spokesperson, was used until the mid to late 1980s. March 17, 1970, both pilots of Eastern Airlines Shuttle Flight 1320, a DC-9-31 carrying 68 passengers and 5 crew, were shot by a deranged hijacker. The first officer was able to take the hijacker's gun and shoot him 3 times before succumbing to his own wounds. Despite gunshot wounds in both arms, the captain was able to fight off the wounded hijacker and land the aircraft safely. Just before Walt Disney World opened in 1971, Eastern became its official airline. It remained the official airline of Walt Disney World and sponsored a ride at the Magic Kingdom Park until its contracting route network forced Disney to switch to Delta shortly before Eastern's 1989 bankruptcy filing. Eastern bought the Lockheed L-1011 TriStar and Airbus A300 widebody jets. The former would become known in the Caribbean as El Grandote. Although Eastern had purchased 4 747s, the delivery slots were sold to Trans World Airlines when Eastern decided to purchase the L-1011. Due to massive delays in the L-1011 program, mainly due to problems with the Rolls-Royce RB211 engines, Eastern leased 2 Boeing 747-100s from Pan Am between 1970 and 1972 and operated the aircraft between Chicago and San Juan as well as from New York to Miami and San Juan. May 18, 1972, Flight 346, a Douglas DC-9-31 landed hard at Fort Lauderdale International Airport, collapsing the landing gear and breaking off the tail. All 10 on board survived. December 29, 1972, Flight 401, a brand new Lockheed L-1011 was preparing to land in Miami, when the flight crew became distracted by a non-functioning gear light. The flight crashed in the Everglades, killing 101 of 176 on board. This was the first major crash of a wide-body aircraft. In 1973, Eastern purchased Care Puerto Rico, a small airline based in Puerto Rico which operated McDonnell Douglas DC-9-30 jets in the Caribbean. November 27, 1973, Flight 300, a McDonnell Douglas DC-9-31 inbound from Pittsburgh International Airport to Akron-Canton Airport landed too far down the runway, hydroplaned and went off the end of the runway and over an embankment in fog, low ceilings, light rain and 1.5-mile visibility. The aircraft was severely damaged and written off. All 26 on board 5 crew, 21 passengers survived with various injuries. September 11, 1974, Flight 212, a Douglas DC-9-31 carrying 78 passengers and 4 crew, crashed while conducting an instrument approach in dense ground fog at Douglas Municipal Airport. The aircraft crashed just short of the runway, killing 72. 3 survivors subsequently died from their injuries. Killed on this flight were James, Peter, and Paul Colbert, the father and older brothers of comedian Stephen Colbert. June 24, 1975, Flight 66, a Boeing 727, crashed into runway approach lights as it penetrated a thunderstorm near the ILS localizer course line at JFK in New York City, killing 113 passengers and crew. The official cause of the accident was a sudden high rate of descent, caused by severe downdrafts from the thunderstorm, and the continued use of the runway despite the hazardous weather. ABA basketball star Wendell Ladner was one of the passengers killed in the crash. In 1975, Eastern was headquartered at 10 Rockefeller Plaza in Manhattan. After Frank Borman became president of Eastern Airlines in late 1975, he moved Eastern's headquarters from Rockefeller Center to Miami-Dade County, Florida. July 2, 1976, a Lockheed L-188 Electra was blown up on the ground by a bomb at Logan International Airport. Eastern's massive Atlanta hub was in direct competition with Delta Airlines, where the two carriers competed heavily to neither's benefit. Delta's less unionized workforce and slowly expanding international route network helped lead it through the turbulent period following deregulation in 1978. September 26, 1978, Eastern Airlines Flight 75, an L-1011, overtook Air Caribbean Flight 309, a Beech 18, on approach to Isla Verde International Airport in San Juan, Puerto Rico. There were no injuries on the Eastern airplane, but all 6 occupants on the Air Caribbean plane were killed when it plummeted and crashed onto a local bar. Eastern Airlines and the FAA later settled with family members of the 6 dead people as well as injured bar clients, paying them almost $5,700,000 for damages. In 1980, a Caribbean hub was started at Luis Muñoz Marin International Airport near San Juan, Puerto Rico. In 1982, Eastern acquired Braniff's South American route network. By 1985, Eastern was the largest ATA airline in terms of passengers and operated in 26 countries on 3 continents. During this era, Eastern's fleet was split between their silver-colored hockey stick livery. The lack of paint reduced weight by 100 pounds and their white-colored hockey stick livery on its Airbus-manufactured planes, which required paint to cover the aircraft's composite skin panels. In 1983, Eastern became the launch customer of Boeing's 757, which was ordered in 1978. Borman felt that its low cost of operation would make it an invaluable asset to the airline in the years to come. Lower oil prices failed to materialize, and the debt created by this purchase coupled with the Airbus A300 purchases in 1977 contributed to the February 1986 sale to Frank Lorenzo's Texas Air. At that time, Eastern was paying over $700,000 in interest each day before they sold a ticket, fueled, or boarded a single aircraft. May 5, 1983, Flight 855, a Lockheed L-1011 TriStar, had all 3 engines shut down in flight. The pilot restarted one of the engines before returning to Miami International Airport. All 172 survived. April 21, 1984, Eastern Airlines Flight 494, a DC-9, suffered an uncommented deployment of reverse thrust during a flight from Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport to Piedmont Triad International Airport in Greensboro, North Carolina, causing the aircraft to roll quickly to the right. The flight crew disabled the affected engine and returned safely to Atlanta. They received the Airline Pilots Association Superior Airmanship Award for their handling of the incident. January 1, 1985, Flight 980, a Boeing 727 struck Mount Illimani on a flight from Silvio Pettirossi International Airport in Asunción, Paraguay, to El Alto International Airport in La Paz, Bolivia. All 19 passengers and 10 crew were killed on impact. Starting about 1985, Eastern offered moonlight specials, with passenger seats on overnight flights scheduled for cargo from 30 freight companies. The flights, which operated between midnight and 7 a.m., served 18 cities in the United States, connecting mainly to Houston. Eric Schmidt of the New York Times said that the services were a hybrid of late-night, red-eye flights and the bare-bones People Express approach to service. The holds of the aircraft were reserved for cargo such as express mail, machine tool parts, and textiles. Because of this, the airline allowed each passenger to take up to 2 carry-on bags. The airline charged $10 for each checked bag, which was shipped standby. The airline charged between 50 cents and $3 for beverages and snacks. Bunny Duck, an Eastern flight attendant quoted in the New York Times, said that the passengers on the special flights were a cross-section of families, college kids, illegal aliens and weirdos from LA. Eastern began losing money as it faced competition from no-frills airlines, such as People Express, which offered lower fares. In an attempt to differentiate itself from its bargain competitors, Eastern began a marketing campaign stressing its quality of service and its rank of highly experienced pilots. Unable to keep up, Borman agreed to the sale of the airline in 1986 to Texas Air, led by Frank Lorenzo, which had already purchased Continental Airlines and lost a bidding war for TWA to Carl Icahn. In February 1987, the Federal Aviation Administration imposed a $9.5 million fine against Eastern Airlines for safety violations, which was the largest fine assessed against an airline until American Airlines was fined $24.2 million in 2010. Eastern's FAA violations all occurred prior to the acquisition by Texas Air. September 15, 1987, Flight 216, a Boeing 727, was seriously damaged in a hard landing in severe winds at Tulsa International Airport. The 55 passengers and 7 crew were not injured. The aircraft was inspected by mechanics at the American Airlines Tulsa maintenance base and cleared to fly. It was then flown to Kansas City and Chicago with passengers, only to be removed from service after skin wrinkles in the fuselage were noticed. A senior American Airlines official later conceded that the Tulsa mechanics erred in their inspection. December 27, 1987, Flight 573, a Douglas DC-9-31, landed hard at Pensacola Regional Airport. The nose gear touched down first, and the aircraft bounced and touched down again, breaking the passenger cabin aft of the wings. The plane stopped with its tail resting on the runway, but all 103 passengers and 4 crew survived. In 1988, Phil Bakes, the president of Eastern Airlines, announced plans to lay off 4,000 employees and eliminate and reduce service to airports in the western United States. He said that the airline was going back to our roots in the East. At the time, Eastern was the largest corporate employer in the Miami area and remained so after the cuts. John Nordheimer wrote in the New York Times that Eastern's prominence in the Miami area decreased as the city became a finance and trade center with a diversified local economy, instead of one based largely on tourism. During Lorenzo's tenure, Eastern was crippled by severe labor unrest that began long before the acquisition. Asked to accept deep cuts in pay and benefits, on March 4, 1989, Lorenzo locked out Eastern's mechanics and ramp service employees, represented by the International Association of Machinists and Aerospace Workers. Concerned that Lorenzo's successful breaking of the IAM would do the same to the pilots and flight attendants unions, the pilots represented by Airline Pilots Association and flight attendants represented by the Transport Workers Union called a sympathy strike, which effectively shut down the airline's domestic operations. Non-contract employees, including airport gate and ticket counter agents and reservation sales agents, could not honor the strike. Due to the lockout and sympathy strike, canceled flights resulted in the loss of millions of dollars in revenue. As a result of the strike, a weakened airline structure, high fuel prices, and inability to compete after deregulation and other financial problems, Eastern filed for bankruptcy protection on March 9, which allowed Eastern to continue operating on a smaller scale. Lorenzo initially sought a sale of the entire airline, and on April 6, Eastern agreed to be acquired by former Major League Baseball Commissioner Peter Ueberroth for $464 million. However, the transaction was terminated on April 12 after Lorenzo refused to give temporary control to a trustee. The sale process was then terminated on April 18, and Lorenzo proposed a sale of $1.8 million in assets that would allow the airline to continue operating independently. In May 1989, Eastern sold its East Coast shuttle service to real estate mogul Donald Trump for $365 million. Trump continued operating the service as the Trump Shuttle. In August, Eastern signed a deal to sell 16 DC-9 aircraft and gates in Philadelphia, Washington, and New York to Midway Airlines for $210 million. In May 1990, American Airlines acquired Eastern's Latin American routes and related assets for $471 million. January 18, 1990, Eastern Airlines Flight 111, a Boeing 727, collided with an EPS service Beechcraft King Air upon landing at Atlanta William B. Hartsfield International Airport, Georgia. The plane received substantial damage, but all 149 passengers and 8 crew members survived unharmed. The plane was later repaired. The King Air was destroyed, with the pilot killed and the first officer seriously injured. After several failed attempts at obtaining creditor approval for restructuring plans, Lorenzo lost control of Eastern in April 1990, when former Continental President Martin Shugru was appointed as trustee to manage Eastern's reorganization. A report prepared by David Shapiro, an examiner appointed by the bankruptcy court overseeing Eastern's bankruptcy filing, concluded that Eastern was shortchanged by Texas Air in numerous transactions between the two. For example, Texas Air bought assets like System 1, a computer reservation operation, from Eastern at a price far below market value. Eastern tried to remain in business in an attempt to correct its cash flow, but to no avail. Under bankruptcy, Eastern launched a 100 days advertising campaign, in which it promised to become a little bit better every day. The ads were conceived by advertising agency Ogilvy & Mather in New York, and started being broadcast on June 17, 1990 during the primetime hours in 33 markets around the United States. The ads featured Martin Shugru, the airline's court-appointed trustee. While the campaign helped the company increase by 73% the number of bookings, it did not stop the company from going bankrupt. Ultimately, Eastern Airlines stopped flying at midnight on Saturday, January 19, 1991. The previous evening, company agents, unaware of the decision, continued to take reservations and told callers that the airline was not closing. Following the announcement, 5,000 of the 18,000 employees immediately lost their jobs. Of the remaining employees, reservation agents were told to report to work at their regular times, while other employees were told not to report to work unless asked to do so. The Eastern shutdown eliminated many airline industry jobs in the Miami and New York City areas. Later that month, Delta Airlines acquired Eastern's gates at Atlanta, and Northwest Airlines acquired Eastern's gates at Washington National.
Here are 5 reasons why you should fly Eastern Airlines right now. Number 1, no advance purchase on Super Savers, so you can save and fly Eastern today. 2, we'll even honor Super Saver tickets from other major airlines without penalty. 3, you can earn a free first-class upgrade. 4, fly 7 Eastern flight segments and earn a free coach ticket. And the best reason? We fly to over 140 cities every day. So call your travel agent or Eastern now. Why hesitate?
If you have any fond memories, please indicate it at the comments below. Thanks for watching, subscribe, and like.